The area of Wigan Flashes was a site of heavy industry that was in use from the mid-19th century. Before that, coal had been mined there on a much smaller scale, and a coal-burning power station was in use on site between 1950 and 1972, the spoil being dumped in the surrounding areas. Subsidence began on site at the beginning of the 20th century, forming the flashes when water started to fill the holes that had been formed by the subsidence. Coal mining started to wind down in 1918, finally ceasing in 1962, when the site gradually began to be taken over by nature. And now the whole 264-hectare site is a haven for wildlife and is designated as a local nature reserve and a site of special scientific interest. Trees were planted on the site, which was then landscaped to produce woods and hay meadows, which have been colonised by many rare plant and animal species. The Flashes became a site of special scientific interest in the late 1980s and was designated as a local nature reserve in 2001, and it has now become one of the most important wetland sites in the UK.
Wigan Flashes and the associated other flashes in the Wigan and Lee NNR have nearly 1% of the UK's freshwater reed bed, and it is really good in that it has bitterns, and they've attempted to nest in a few years. It also has large numbers of reed warblers and water rails and many other reed bed species. So we find water voles and water shrews within the reed bed.
In recent years, management of the site was taken over by the Lancashire Wildlife Trust in partnership with Wigan Council. Wigan Flashes is a haven for ornithologists, botanists and nature lovers, and is a prime example of how an area of England's dark satanic mills can be transformed into England's green and pleasant land.
The willow tit is one of the fastest declining species in Britain. It's down to less than 5,000 pairs, according to the recent RSPB survey. It's a specialist in the secondary woodland habitats that are wet because it needs to create its own holes, and to do that it needs the timber to have rotted with a special sort of soft rot that allows the willow tits, which are only small birds the size of great tits, to empty out the material from the nest.
The ideal habitat for willow tits is wet woodland and damp woodland margins with a dense scrub layer, and they excavate their nest holes in stands of dead and rotting wood. Willow tits will use a new nest hole each year, but they may use the same stand of dead wood multiple times, and breeding pairs need at least 2 hectares of suitable habitat.
Willow tits, one of the reasons they also use this habitat is that they are predated by a range of woodland species. So these include great spotted woodpecker and sparrowhawks, which actually find it very difficult to hunt through these scrubby woodlands. But strangely, one of the birds that is quite important in willow tit ecology is the great tit. Willow tits nest remarkably early, and we think this may be an adaptation to actually nest before the great tits start to nest, because great tits quite regularly attempt to usurp the willow tit from the nest when it's excavated it. So blue tits, great tits wait until the willow tit has finished nesting, and then they push the willow tit off and then use the nest hole for themselves. these lovely grasslands. They're managed as a traditional hay meadow, although they're all planted in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Over time, they've colonised with many species, including bee orchids and marsh orchids. Willow tit isn't a species that uses the high canopy. It spends a lot of its time relatively low down and nests in trees at a relatively low height, anywhere between about a foot from the ground up to just above head height. So it's spending a lot of time in this lower canopy, and because of that it needs to make sure that the lower canopy area is very busy with brambles and secondary trees and is quite dynamic. And this helps to protect the willow tit nest because it makes it difficult for deer, people and sparrowhawks and other predators to actually get into the wood, but it's also a source of food for the willow tits because they eat a lot of spiders, crane flies, as well as moths and caterpillars. So they need this busy habitat, and one of the things that happens that is reducing the numbers across the country is obviously secondary woodland matures, and when it matures you get a more gappy structure and a lot less understory. That and climate change are probably the two things that are going on that are affecting the willow tit populations badly.